The dream of home ownership has become a nightmare for many. So do our politicians have any ideas for fixing it? Hello, I'm Vicky Young and welcome to Politics Live. Joining me today, former Conservative advisor Salma Shah, Ava Santina Evans from Politics Joe and Fraser Myers from Spiked Online. Kemi Badenoch's Conservatives are in Manchester for their conference and they've got this offer for young people wanting to buy a house.
When someone takes their first job, the first £5,000 they pay in national insurance won't go to the taxman. It will go towards a deposit on their first home.
Meanwhile, the government says it will change the house buying system to cut costs, reduce delays and stop gazumping. So, whose idea is better? And is it right to give police more powers to restrict repeat protests? If you've got a view about that story or any other, remember it's your BBC News, so we want to hear your voice. Get in touch using the details on screen now. Well, as we saw there, the Conservatives are at their annual party conference. And, of course, our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, is there too. Now, Henry, Kemi Badenoch, the leader, said yesterday that the party had a mountain to climb. It's a huge challenge that they face, isn't it?
Certainly feels like it here, Vicky. I mean, it's 2 years since the Conservative Party last had their conference in Manchester, and it just feels very different. It feels, frankly, much sparser. Now, a lot of that, I think, is the inevitability of going from government to opposition, but I think part of it is that, you know, this is a party which is worried that it's being crowded out of the conversation, crowded out of the main two double act that it's been in for more than a century by Reform UK. And I think the main thing that is seared into my brain after just 24 hours here is the image of this blue carpet. I mean, it's a lovely shade of blue, but it's everywhere. And it's everywhere because it's where the exhibitionist stands used to be. It's where Tory MPs used to be. And there's just these vast expanses of empty blue carpet in the hall behind me because there frankly aren't that many people here.
So what is the strategy? How are they going to set about trying to win back voters? And what can they do this week to do that?
Well, there's actually quite an interesting and perhaps slightly subtle shift that has been on display already at this party conference. Kemi Badenoch won the Conservative Party leadership over Robert Jenrick a year ago with a pledge to not come up with policy too soon. He had lots of them. Her defining pitch in the leadership campaign last year was to take her time and for the Conservatives to take their time because she didn't believe the public was willing to give the Conservatives a hearing after just turfing them out of office. But so far this week we've had quite a lot of policy. Of course, Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, gave a speech earlier today and talked about quite significant cuts to various areas of government spending that he wanted to carry out, quite significant reform to business rates. Kemi Badenoch has, of course, entered this week with quite significant changes to Conservative Party policy on climate change, on the European Convention of Human Rights. The big question, though, being asked by Conservative MPs and Conservative Party members, those that are still here, is whether it's all come a bit too late, given what's happened in the polls and, of course, what also happened in the local elections earlier this year in terms of losing ground to Reform UK.
OK, Henry, thank you very much indeed. More from you, I'm sure, later in the week. Salma, it's a huge challenge, as we've just heard there. What do you think the party should be doing at this point in the electoral cycle, given we are still a long way from a general election?
Well, I think inevitably when there is always a question around the leader and the leader's suitability and whether the leader is going to survive, there is this natural inclination to try and reach for policy and be able to start talking about it, to define yourself and grab a little bit of the space. And, you know, Henry's totally right. You've got Reform with this huge character in Nigel Farage sort of taking up and occupying what used to be the Conservatives' preserve. That's not necessarily the right thing to do. There is still a big sort of repair job to do in terms of the Conservative brand and damage control. But I can absolutely appreciate that wanting to come out with policy to say that fundamentally there is something there is inevitably what is going to happen.
Ava, what do you think they should be doing at this point?
I think they should be putting together some progressive policy. I really liked the idea of a tax rebate for young people if they're going to buy their first home. I don't know how well that's going to work in practice, because the issue you have is that young people can't save up for a deposit while they're also renting from a landlord. But, you know, those sort of policies are interesting, and that's how you bring people back in. And it almost feels it's totally out of kilter with what Kemi Badenoch is attempting to do at the top. You know, there's sort of these signatories being added to leaving the ECHR convention. I mean, that is so... It's so ridiculous, and it's so, you know, de facto reform policy. I can't imagine that's going to bring anyone back into the fold.
And Fraser, what do you think?
I think, you know, even if they land on a good message, the problem is the messenger. The fact is that people fundamentally do not trust the Conservative Party. And even on migration, you know, the biggest issue in the country, they are trusted less than the Labour Party to deal with this issue. This is the Labour Party that has let in record numbers of illegal migrants. So I think that's their difficulty. It's interesting to see them scrabble around, whether it's, I don't know whether they're following reform or actually just following public opinion, because people are really sick and tired of seeing high levels of illegal migration, people being housed in asylum hotels, a huge cost to the public purse and all the risks that those bring.
The ECHR issue has been something that's been long debated in the Conservative Party, and one of the things that was supposed to happen in 22 was the British Bill of Rights, which was at one point abandoned because it was supposed to replicate or transpose at least the ECHR or the Convention into British law. So I think this is something that's long running, and I imagine it's because they want to bring back some of that reform support that they've ceded with this issue. So it's not really a retail policy. I mean, if you ask the average person on the street, you know, what's the ECHR? I think there'd be quite a lot of confusion, but it is about bringing back some of that core old support. So I can appreciate why she's done it. Whether it has the impact, as you say, rightly, there is an issue with trust around migration policy. Whether she does it or not remains to be seen.
Well, they are announcing policies, as you say, and we can see, and you referred, Ava, to one of them there. Conservatives pledge £5,000 tax rebate for young home buyers. Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, set out the details a little earlier.
So to younger people, I say, we will get debt off your back. We can and we will. If you work hard and do the right thing, the Conservative Party is on your side. So we will reduce the benefits bill, and as a consequence, we will fund tax cuts that are laser-focused on aspiring young people. So we will introduce something called the First Job Bonus. When someone takes their first job, the first £5,000 they pay in national insurance won't go to the taxman. It will go towards a deposit on their first home, helping them buy a home, build a family, save for the future. That is the Conservative dream, a dream that built my life. It is why I stand before you today, and I'll fight every single day to make sure that that dream is burning bright for younger people and for generations to come.
Well, that was Mel Stride, and we're joined now by Claire Coutinho, who is the Shadow Energy Secretary. She is at the conference there. Thank you very much for speaking to us today. Let's start with that policy. You're promising a tax cut. Inevitably, those who earn more will presumably claw back that tax cut a bit quicker, won't they? They'll also have to be rich enough to be able to afford to buy a house.
Well, look, this is about giving people a bit back. We know that younger people have had a really hard time, and actually we know the number of people who are neither employed or in education is growing for young people. You see a growing group of young people going straight onto benefits. So this is about recovering our sense of aspiration for people, and being able to have £5,000 back in a national insurance rebate, I think is a good way to help people start their lives and just give them that extra boost, extra step up the ladder.
But obviously those earning more will get it quicker, won't they? Do you think that's fair? Are they the ones that really need it?
Well, we want to reward work and aspiration, and you know, this is about helping people. As I said, you could either use that towards saving to buy a home or on other things that you need in your lives. And just because you get there quicker, you can still get there if you are on a different paid job. And I think compared to the system that we have now, this is better for everybody, every young person who goes into full paid work, and it's about rewarding that culture of hard work and aspiration.
Mel Stride talked a lot, didn't he, about fiscal responsibility and getting debt down. But there's also quite a lot of giveaways here, aren't there, as well? I mean, you know, is that a bit of a contradiction?
Well, if you looked at what Mel was talking about, it's resetting that sense that the efforts of your work is going to be rewarded. And I think that is something that we've started to lose in this country. And so being able to cut spending and then reward, for example, high street businesses which have had a really hard time, so your retail, hospitality and leisure businesses, you also announced that they would have a 100% cut on business rates, being able to give young people that extra carrot as you go into your full job and say, hey, look, we support you, we think that's great that you've done that. My announcement was that we have a plan to instantly cut people's electricity bills by 20%. That's something that the government could do tomorrow. This is all about making sure that if you're someone who's a striver, who is working hard, we're making life easier for you. And I would just say, actually, one of the things that the Labour Party is doing, they talk about poverty, but actually they're making the cost of childcare, of food, of electricity, of housing more expensive, and now they're going to tax people more to redistribute that, to take some of the pain away. So we take a completely different approach. We want to support you if you're working, we want to reward aspiration, and we're going to do that by making sure that we give young people a better start, that we're cutting business rates for businesses on the high street, and that we're cutting people's electricity bills.
OK, well, let me put to you a comment we've had from Mick in Bishop Auckland. He has got in touch with us about that policy of giving a national insurance rebate to young people. And he says the issue is that we have a housing shortage and that wages are kept low. Giving £5,000 to young people to help buy houses will not make a difference. None of the parties at present are prepared to deal with the issue of wealth inequality. What do you say to him that this is about the fact that there just aren't enough houses? That's the problem, it's the supply.
Well, look, you've also got to take on planning reform. We've got James Cleverly who's going to be talking today. And, you know, at the peak of house building under the Conservatives, we were building the most houses in 40 years. So, yes, I absolutely think we've got to build things in the country. One of the things I talked about in my speech was nuclear, for example. We set out amendments to make it easier for people to build nuclear. But I don't think this takes away from the fact that it is hard for young people to save. Like I said, they've had a really difficult few years. This doesn't mean at the end of that £5,000 they will be able to buy the house, but it gives them a start. It gives them a few steps. It gives them hope, and like I said, it gives them a reward for aspiring, and I think that is a good thing to do.
OK, Claire, just stay with us for a second. I just want to bring in the panel. Ava, you said that you were slightly attracted by this policy to give £5,000 national insurance rebate.
I think it's a start, but look, they're in Manchester. If you look at a graduate salary there, you're looking at around £28,000 to £32,000. If someone is renting a property, they're probably spending nearly £1,000 per month to a landlord. That's what they're giving to a landlord. How on earth will they save up the rest of the £25,000 that is needed to collect a deposit? I mean, it's brilliant to offer £5,000, but it's absolutely nowhere near enough. I would also just come back on the house building there. You know, we are really in actually a house building crisis. The Conservatives might have built a couple of houses because there was a complete drought during the 80s, but really what we do need is a return to the sort of Attlee government where we were building at record speed.
And Claire, just on that issue, when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, he did try to bring in mandatory house building targets, didn't he? But actually, Conservative MPs got those plans watered down.
Well, actually, we had those targets for years, and like I said, we did have the highest rate of house building for 40 years. But look, we can't be complacent. It is something that I worry about. If you look at London, for example, the Labour government has cut house building targets, and you've seen an absolute collapse in house building in the most popular capital city pretty much anywhere in the world. So look, we do have to keep the pressure up. We make sure that we're building homes for the next generation. But what we've set out today, like I said, is plans to make sure that we can support businesses on the high street, give those young people a standing start, and cut people's electricity bills, which is something the government could do tomorrow. And we'll be pushing those points in the weeks and months ahead.
Can I ask you about your welfare plans? Because Mel Stride, again, talked about making pretty big cuts to the welfare bill, yet when the government tried to bring in more modest cuts, you didn't support them.
Well, if you look at the cuts that they were bringing in, they were quite cat-handed, if you don't mind me saying. Like, I used to work at the CSJ, and it was obviously a Treasury exercise. But what we've said is, yes, we do need to cut welfare, and we've offered to talk to Labour and work with them to come up with better plans. I think even welfare experts who believed you should cut welfare didn't think those plans were good.
What did you think was wrong? What was wrong with them, in your view?
Well, they were clearly driven by Treasury, and we've said you need to bring back face-to-face assessments, for example. They were using the point system, which I think is much blunter. And we've also said there is a principle here. If you've got a mild mental health issue, something like anxiety, for example, or depression, we should be making sure that you're getting the treatment that you need, not just parking you on welfare. And at the beginning of this conversation, I said something which I think we should all be very worried about. There's an increasing trend of young people going from education not into their first job but onto welfare, and we know that the longer it takes to get into your first job, the harder it is. So I do think it is really important that we're not saying, if you've got a mild mental health problem, you can then just sign on and we'll forget about you. We actually need to get you the support that you need.
But I'm pretty sure that was part of the plan, wasn't it, by Labour? I mean, surely, even if it wasn't perfect, it wasn't exactly what you wanted, if you want to cut the welfare bill, what they were proposing, it would have been a start and maybe would have given you more credibility with voters who might now look at this and just think you've plucked a number out of nowhere.
Well, firstly, when we were in government, we talked about cutting the welfare bill. It was in our manifesto. It was something that we did at the beginning of our term in office. We reduced the number of homes which were workless, for example. So I do think we do have credibility on this issue. And secondly, Kemi has said since then she'd be happy to work with Labour, talk to them and say, look, we can share support if you're doing something that we think is the right thing. We've now set out our plans. And let me just say this, it's one of the most important issues facing the country, because we have a complete gap now with our sickness benefits and other countries around the world. And it's going to, cost us £100 billion, something that I think everybody knows we can't afford. But it's also a human tragedy. This is people who essentially the state is giving up on, and we need to do better than that.
There's been quite a few announcements, actually, from your leader and your colleagues as well, ahead of this conference. Another one, of course, on illegal migration and the plan to, I think, leave the European Convention on Human Rights. Can I just clarify that the plan is definitely to leave the ECHR? Because yesterday, Kemi Badenoch, speaking to my colleague Laura Kuenssberg, talked about monitoring it and being prepared to leave. Where is the party on that policy?
No, the plan is to leave the ECHR.
OK, and why do you think that Kemi Badenoch talked about monitoring it?
I don't know, but I sat around the Shadow Cabinet. She's talked about her plans. She's talked about it in multiple interviews, and the plan is to leave the ECHR, partly because we need to get a grip on illegal migration and we need to do all of those things to rebuild public confidence. I worry very much that the country at the moment is divided. It's at a tipping point. Not only is it an unfair question of fairness, but people are feeling unsafe. And the first thing that a state needs to do is to be able to protect the borders, provide people with that security that they need to feel that their nation is strong and that they can be secure at home.
So you're saying that if the Conservatives are re-elected, you would immediately start that process of leaving the ECHR?
Yes.
Yeah, OK. You also talked about removing people, £150,000 a year, who've entered the country illegally. And again, there was a question about where these people would be sent. Do we know the answer to that?
Well, firstly, we would return them to their home country. And one of the things that the plan sets out is that if there is a country which is refusing to take people, we would use visa sanctions so that we would be able to have a lever to say, actually, you do have to take the people we want to return, whether it's a foreign criminal or someone who's overstayed their visa, for example. And then if you had no luck with that, we would have a third country processing, which we already had before. We had that in the scheme that we'd put forward previously in the Rwanda scheme, and actually being able to leave some of these conventions would make it easier for us to be able to apply that. But ultimately, I would just say this, if we can't get a grip on illegal migration in this country, then I think we will see further division and further fear, and I really worry about what's going to happen to us. So we've set out the policy which is to leave the ECHR, but there's various other elements to it as well. And I think it's really important that everybody in the Shadow Cabinet backed it, and we have to do this for the country to make sure that we can give people that sense that we're a strong and secure nation.
And then finally, to turn to your brief in particular, the Climate Change Act. Kemi Badenoch has talked about scrapping that, and the former Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, has said that would be a catastrophic mistake. Why have you decided to do this?
Look, one of the things that is happening is the Climate Change Act is forcing ministers to make decisions which makes electricity more expensive. At the same time, the government wants people to adopt electric vehicles and electric home heating. So these two things are pulling in the complete opposite direction. And we've said, look, this is not the right way of going about it. One of the biggest problems that we've got for the country, and the priority for any energy policy, is to bring down the price of electricity. We've got the most expensive electricity in the world, so that's why we had to leave the Climate Change Act, and our policy that we've set forward, the Cheap Power Plan, first 2 steps a day, would cut people's electricity bills by 20%. This is in the gift of ministers. They could do it, and they have to, because whether it's households or businesses, people are struggling, and actually our priority has got to be bringing down electricity prices. And by the way, if you care about decarbonisation, that's actually better, because cheaper electricity would mean that people would want to have, you know, electric vehicles or home heating. So this is by far a much more sensible policy.
And what do you say to Theresa May, who has said it's a catastrophic mistake, a retrograde step which upends 17 years of consensus between the political parties?
Well, look, our job is not here to maintain consensus. It's to work out what the right thing to do for the country is. And as we set out policies, I'm sure over the course of this conference, we'll have people, you know, from the party who will disagree with us. But one of the things I would say we got wrong before is, you know, looking like we were a party that was focused on itself. And actually, we need to focus on the country. It's a really difficult time, whether that's cost of living, whether that's growth. And I would say one of the most important things we need to do to solve both of those issues is to bring down the price of electricity. And that's why we've set out a plan. Like I said, it could be done tomorrow. It's in the gift of ministers. It's not some fake £300 promises which will come on the never, never. And it would cut electricity bills by 20%. I think that would be a great thing to do for your viewers.
OK, Claire Coutinho, the Shadow Energy Secretary, thank you very much for speaking to us today from your conference. So there's actually a lot of policy in there. You touched on it earlier, particularly about the ECHR and that decision finally by the Conservatives, you know, having talked about it for a very long time, to say they're going to leave. Do you think it's a vote winner?
No, as I said earlier, I'm not. It's a vote winner in the sense that people are very focused and motivated by small boats and what they see as an unfairness in the immigration system, especially when you have the ability to appeal. And, you know, there are suggestions that people are coached to appeal in certain ways to be able to take the support of the convention. So I think in that sense, I mean, it requires a lot of explaining. So it's not necessarily about the vote, but it is really about how you bring different elements of the right together. The one thing that I do think is consistent around these policies is that there seems to be a sledgehammer to crack a nut element to it, which is we want to get ourselves out of the ECHR because we want to deal with migration. We want to scrap the Climate Change Act because we want to bring energy prices down. But this is not a whole system thinking. And this is not me talking as a political tactician. I think that, you know, what they're saying is pretty sensible from that perspective. But this is me speaking about actually how are we going to solve those big challenges of the next 10 and 20 years. And, you know, I'm afraid I agree with Theresa May. I think it's retrograde because we're not thinking about the future. We're thinking about the short-termism, and that is the real classic problem of politics.
Fraser, do you agree with that? That it's particularly on the climate change move?
No, not at all. I mean, the Climate Change Act basically puts climate policy above all other considerations, and that's obviously a real problem when you've had, you know, decades of energy policy being taken down that path. It is clearly the case that, you know, going off coal, reducing fossil fuels and adopting wind energy instead has resulted in us actually having less electricity. We're generating less electricity than we were 20 years ago, and clearly that's going to put up prices. It binds the hands of ministers in ways that are actually not helpful for the country. You know, we're having deindustrialisation as a result of these policies, and clearly that has to be reversed. There has to be another way of dealing with the problem of climate change.
What about the economic consequences and costs of climate change? I think it's very sort of one-sided to think about the Climate Change Act and solely about pricing. The other aspect of this is whether successive governments have been sensible and focused on bringing on board the infrastructure that is required to either make renewables work or to have sustainable efficiency around energy policy. So I think that it is very, I think, wrong to say that the Climate Change Act has tied ministers' hands and not think about the other things that ministers have not done in a system. Also, including the fact that conflict has sent energy prices up because of the way that we are dependent. And this is, in fact, the fact that we have not created our own energy generation through innovative things like nuclear, for example.
Yes, and that, you know, there's definitely elements of truth to that. But what you have to remember is that essentially we are, you know, if we are deindustrializing as a result of higher energy costs, if we are producing less electricity as a result of energy costs, you have to recognise what is the common factor there. That is a product of the Climate Change Act. It is a product of net zero. It's that element of it that has to be
that's a massive,
reversed.
I think that's
and in terms of making, we have also underinvested in the infrastructure, but you're not going to make renewables work because they only work a tiny amount of the time. You know,
but
wind farms are only active.
I wasn't talking about renewables. And well, sorry, Ava, you were going to make the point, and I agree with you, that saying that deindustrialisation is happening as a consequence of energy prices, that is one part of what is happening today in the economy right now. But there are issues with grid connections for, you know, the national grid. There are issues that go way beyond just the issue of pricing.
It's a pretty significant part. And then there are specific cases, like if you take the Port Talbot Steelworks, you know, people are losing their jobs so that can be greenified. Clearly, people are losing their jobs in car factories, van factories, because you have to meet the zero emissions vehicle
steelworks
mandate.
Were under threat and have been for over a decade or so. And there have been many attempts by the government for different reasons in terms of whether it be the currency changes with the price of iron ore that has impacted production at steel plants. So it's not just about that.
But specifically, the reason people are losing 2,800 jobs is because we're moving away from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, and that is to meet the climate change.
I think it's quite reductive to talk about this in a way that is just about energy pricing and not thinking about the wider implications of climate change and the economic impact of that. I also think that focusing it on one act and not thinking about actually how are we thinking about our systems and our structures and how are we doing things that is actually generating electricity, whether that be nuclear or something a bit more innovative. I think that is the problem. If you make it about one act and think that that's going to scrap it and it's going to change everything and everything will be fine after that, I think that is ridiculous.
I don't think that everything would be fine if you leave the Climate Change Act. I don't think everything would be fine if you leave the ECHR on the migration issue. But often these steps are necessary but insufficient if you want to get a grip on the issue.
But if you halt the Climate Change Act and then you also pull out of your climate obligations around the world, do you not then lead to an issue with, well, what we're talking about with, you know, the ECHR and why the Conservatives want to leave the ECHR, which is we have mass migration, you have a mass movement of people moving from countries that have been affected by climate change and no longer can live there. So they do come to places like Britain.
I don't think that climate change is a key cause of migration.
There's a lot of evidence around Libya, especially around the civil war in Libya, about people flocking to cities because they were no longer able to work in agricultural areas around the country, and that is directly because of climate change.
And biodiversity.
The civil war is a bigger factor.
I think there is evidence to suggest that, and biodiversity decline, which is, you know, absolutely tied with carbon. That is also creating impacts on economy and what we're actually able to extract as natural resources as well. So I think you have to take a systems approach. And as I say, I think just talking about it from a price perspective is too reductive.
OK, now we were also talking a bit about welfare reform earlier, and we want to hear from you about all of that, welfare and the benefit system. So get in touch with Your Voice, Your BBC News, with your thoughts, particularly if you have personal experience you want to share. You can send us a message or record a short video note. Our contact details are on screen now. Let's turn to a government announcement today, which is unusual during someone else's conference, but they have made an announcement about reforming the house buying system, which is aiming, they say, to cut costs and reduce delays. What do you think about this plan, Ava? I mean, it's maybe a bit unusual that the government's making an announcement during the Tory party conference, but they obviously think today is the day to do this, about shaking up the way that houses are bought and sold.
I mean, it's going to save people around £700, which I think is, you know, that's brilliant for young people. You want to be able to keep every penny that you have so that you can spend it on your house once you do purchase it. But the issue is, you know, the issue long precedes that. Is, you know, we're talking about young people who cannot save for a deposit because they simply are giving all of their salary over to a landlord. And I do worry that Labour, with a sort of build, baby, build policy, they're ignoring the huge elephant in the room, which is that landlords have usurped most of the viable property in this country, which means that first-time buyers cannot get onto the market. And, you are looking at a Labour Party that has the most MPs ever elected to the House of Commons. I do worry
you think they
that
should be being more ambitious in some way?
Yeah, and I put this to the Prime Minister last week when I interviewed him. I did ask him, do you think that perhaps you should ban your MPs from being landlords? Because it is a policy that is negatively and detrimentally affecting young people in this country, to which he said no, but he did acknowledge that it was pretty impossible before the age of 35 to get onto the housing ladder. Actually, he even laughed about, 35 possibly being actually rather young to get onto the housing ladder. It's such a huge problem, and I worry that these sort of £700 here, £5,000 here from the Conservatives are sort of fluff policies rather than dealing with the issue at source.
Faisal, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you always get tinkering on this issue. Where is the politician who faces it with the gravity that it deserves? We've been in a housing crisis for as long as I can remember, certainly, and every announcement feels incredibly piecemeal. Even this Labour government, which essentially staked its reputation on house building when it was elected, is falling short of its own targets. We really need to throw the kitchen sink at this issue. So it's not just, OK, it's nice to have an extra £700 and make it easier for people to buy houses, but we also need to reform planning. We also need to build more social housing.
Which the government would say they are attempting to do.
Yeah, but clearly the results speak for themselves, don't they? House building is going down.
Salma, do you think that this is? Do you think it's a key issue? I mean, particularly that you were talking there about young people, though we're talking about maybe people under 40 who can't afford to buy their
They're
first
still young
home.
people.
They are. That's very young, I think.
From where I'm sat, it is. Look, I used to be in the housing department. I've seen a lot of these policies up front.
And what's the stumbling block in your view? What's the biggest issue here?
So here's the thing, and I'm sure there are lots of people still in the department that will disagree with me about this. This is demand supply. And everybody is very focused on the supply side, but they forget that demand is important in terms of mortgages being available, finance being available, salaries being able to match that financing requirement. So there is, I think, some work that needs to be done on the demand side of this as well. And on the supply, there's so much outside of the government's control. The thing that they've announced today is great. It's fine. It'll sort of help move the market a little bit. But fundamentally, if the price of concrete is going up, if the price of labour is going up on skills, if the price of sales is going up, if everything is going up, inflation, NICs, everything else, then you can see why there is going to be some kind of contraction in building. So it's one of those areas that is a massive issue because it tells you everything you need to know about the state of the country, which is, can you buy a property? Can you find security? And the solution to it is not simple at all. It's one of the most complex economic problems that we have.
Well, can I just add to that as well? I would love to see a politician come out with a bold ban office building plan, because the problem that you've got in a lot of our major cities is there are many companies who'd like to make a quick buck and they build offices because it is, well, it's frankly easier to rent a large space to, one company than it is to rent out smaller spaces to multiple different people. I'm sort of getting into the weeds a little bit. But particularly where I live in central London, I look at the new offices being built every single day. The offices that are currently there are empty. There should be ban empty offices, ban empty homes. And I think that that's how you could sort of skirt around a lot of the planning regulation that we have in this country.
There is a lot of policy around that already in terms of commercial to residential use, and you make it a lot easier in the planning system. In fact, where we are today in Westminster, that is supposed to be, that is their policy. And it was under the Conservatives in Westminster as well. I think that we have to take a step back from this because what we see isn't necessarily the total reflection of what's happening in the housing market. I do think stagnant wages have been a massive contributor to this, but the mortgage market and what you do in terms of being able to get on the property ladder, where is the deposit line, where is the repayment line? I think Treasury's never really looked at what the possibilities are. They've done things like Help to Buy. I actually think the £5,000 policy the Conservatives announced is great because the deposit is the barrier. But where do we find different ways of providing financing term that will
government-backed mortgages, perhaps? I do.
There are government guaranteed mortgage schemes. There are quite a few.
No, I know. But what I'm thinking is that if you are a renter who's proved that you can pay rent on time for 3 or over 3 years, say, should you not then qualify for a mortgage that perhaps is government-backed? that perhaps doesn't require
if there are
a
any
deposit.
bankers watching,
let's
have a think about the ideas.
Let's also talk about another story which is dominated, which is, have a look at this, police to get broader powers to restrict repeated protests. This was, of course, the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, making that announcement at the weekend and talking about police being able to take into account the cumulative impact of previous protests, meaning they can instruct organisers to hold events elsewhere, for example. Fraser, what do you make of what she has announced?
Well, first of all, let's not beat around the bush. Those protests the weekend were pretty despicable. For people to, after 2 British Jews were killed in cold blood in Britain, to then go out on the streets demanding the destruction of the Jewish state, for Intifada, to rail against Zionism, which is something that pretty much most British Jews believe in, is despicable. But having said that, I don't think that we should be banning these protests. I don't think we should be restricting these protests. I think it's important for everyone to have free speech, even speech we disagree with. And I think sometimes in cases like this, you want to see who people are. Let them show you how despicable they are. I'm not surprised that they carried on protesting against the instructions of the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary and the police, because these are the same people who protested on October the 8th several years ago. Even the respectable part of this campaign, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, supposedly the more mainstream version of the Palestine movement, they were organising their protests in the middle of the Hamas pogrom when people were being slaughtered at a music festival. They thought that was an appropriate time to protest against Israel and to vent their fury at the Jewish state. So, yeah.
Ava, what do you think of what Shabana Mahmood has said, that the police might need more powers?
I think they have enough powers. It's actually rather draconian, the crackdown on protests in this country. And I think that one of the great bastions of, being British is your right to protest. I would disagree with you about what happened on Saturday. It was a long organised protest. It had been planned for weeks, if not months in advance.
You don't think they should have suspended it, not being banned by the police, but suspended it in light of what had happened?
Well, I think that this answer requires nuance. So the report that was given back to me by one of my reporters that I edited was multiple Jewish people arguing that the far-right Israeli government should not be conflated with Judaism and with being Jewish. And that is what I saw in the report. And I think that, what happened on Thursday is incredibly frightening for a multitude of reasons, particularly because these are British Jews. But it's more frightening if we're going to conflate British Jews with the acts of a far-right Israeli government. And I think that's sort of the murky water that we're almost wading into with this conversation.
Salma, do you think that they should have not protested on Saturday?
I think it's a question of tone and appropriateness, and I think that decision was with them and should remain with them and not with the police or the Home Secretary. But I do think that for the Home Secretary, having worked in the Home Office, it's a really difficult thing to balance public safety against people's rights. So it's rights and freedoms. And there is certainly, with far-right protests in the UK, alongside, protests that do have people chanting things that are anti-Semitic. I think all of that is not about freedom of speech. It's about public protection when you think about it from the Home Secretary's point of view. And she will be in between a rock and a hard place on this.
And you should be arrested for that. If that's what you're doing on these marches, you should be arrested.
So the question then that you posed, which is, do the police have enough powers? I think there should be some kind of review on where policing power is and what is prosecution power as well, because that is where sometimes actually I think there is a gap between where people fall
in the sense that people are being arrested, but then it's not.
Yeah, what's the process for
prosecuted.
prosecution at the end of this?
And a real gap of knowledge as well with many police officers, because there was certainly some confusion around the prescription of the now terror group Palestine Action compared to just flying a Palestinian flag. And there were reports of multiple people being arrested or being interviewed under caution for flying a Palestine flag. That's really frightening, and that shouldn't be happening in Britain.
But Fraser, this idea that the police should look at the almost like how frequent these marches are, the fact that they're happening in similar places, the routes they're taking, that the police should look at that as well, that in itself becomes potentially intimidating for members of the Jewish community?
Well, I find this argument around disruption slightly disingenuous. I don't think that's the big problem with these protests. Especially if they're taking place in Parliament Square or Trafalgar Square, that's not hugely disruptive. You could make a different argument, I think, if people were protesting outside synagogues on a weekly basis. I think You know, the right to protest always does come with certain restrictions, certain times of day, certain routes you're allowed to take. But clearly the police have a lot of powers to deal with protests, and it seems as if, you know, looking at the last government, it felt as if we had a new protest law being introduced practically every year. So, you know, I don't think that's the issue here. I think the issue is the lack of political leadership in condemning these protests, and I think likes of Keir Starmer, Shabana Mahmood are reaching for a ban so they can put a stop to something that clearly is causing offence, but they don't want to stand up to it. They don't want to say, actually, we think there's a lot of, you know, these protests attract anti-Semites or whatever it might be.
Actually, Shabana Mahmood said that it was un-British last week. I mean, it's a bit surprising having Conservatives sort of defending the actions, but I think those of us who've been in the Home Office have a different kind of camaraderie with each other. But I do think that, you know, Shabana really did step out and say that these protests were un-British, and she advised against protesting on Saturday, particularly. Now, I don't think that I personally would have suggested that. It is a tonal thing, but I think that, you know, they have called out anti-Semitic chants and behaviour, and I think that where the police can, they have been able to extract people from these crowds.
We're seeing some of the pictures, by the way, from the weekend of those marches.
Yeah, it's just important to understand, where does the power lie? And again, it's this question of unintended consequences. If the police is given more powers, what does it then bring in? Are we going to start doing this for climate action protesters as well?
I think a lot of people would like to see that, wouldn't they?
Well, it'd be rather fun. When you're disrupted, you can see why people would like to see that. But there are lots of questions that we need to ask before we get to the point of deciding that there has to be a ban.
I just think that we need to think carefully about how we're talking about these protests. You had Ben Houchen yesterday on Laura Kuenssberg's programme, and he was suggesting that a Jewish protester was a useful idiot. I mean, that's a really frightening thing to say, to be described as a useful idiot. What, are you going to arrest him because he doesn't agree with the prevailing line of the government?
I don't think he's suggesting he should be arrested, but he was...
I hope not. I hope no one will be arrested for... Yeah, or someone should be arrested. People should not be arrested for the content of their speech. I think that has, you know, that has to hold across the board, no matter what we think of their speech. People should not be arrested because of the theme of their protests. You know, if people then go on to commit other crimes in their protest, then that's fine. But I think, you know, we would avoid a lot of this trouble, avoid a lot of the accusations around two-tier policing, if the content of what people said was not the focus of so much of
Salma, what about
action.
police resources? Because that is the other side of it that was touched upon, I think, by the Home Secretary, that this is now meaning that there are, you know, hundreds, thousands of police officers having to be drafted in to then police these marches, which are happening very, very regularly.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is going to be a consideration. But I don't think that is ultimately... The practicality of policing protests should not be at the forefront of how you make this decision or how you choose to make this decision. And that is just government by balance sheet, rather than trying to understand what are the issues and how are we actually making sure that protest is free, available, but also careful, I think I would characterise it as.
Ava, do you think that the police resourcing should come into this? The fact that she was making the point, wasn't she, that police, at a time when actually you might have wanted more resources outside of synagogues and indeed mosques, actually they were having to go and police these protests.
Yeah, I mean... It does seem like an extraordinary waste of money, I think, to the ordinary taxpayer who'd like to see, you know, their police follow up on a phone being stolen or their house being burgled. It does seem rather extraordinary that they're spending most of their weekends down on Parliament Square arresting 72-year-olds. You know, it doesn't really seem like a fantastic use of resources. But I do spend a lot of time, you know, I partly live in an Orthodox Hasidic area, and it is really frightening looking at how security guards have had to stand outside those synagogues. I do think they deserve police out there instead.
OK, that is all for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and iPlayer.